Okay, this is chapter 11, our last half of our unit that will be tested on the nervous system. And so we have already mentioned that the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and super complex, does a whole lot, senses smells and touch and pressure and pain, and it perceives depth and motion and thinking and remembering and problem solving. I mean, all the things, right? And the brain consists of two cerebral hemispheres. Hemisphere means half of a sphere, and so you put them together to make the brain. There's the diencephalon found in the middle of the brain. There's the brain stem that connects the brain to the spinal cord, and the cerebellum found on the posterior part of the brain. And of course, they're central to the peripheral nerves. So you have afferent pathways coming in and efferent pathways going out, the sensory neurons and the motor neurons. And some tissues that are really important that help serve as protection for the brain and the spinal cord are the meninges. And we'll talk about meningitis in a little bit. But so they are soft tissues made of connective tissue, dense connective tissue, and there's three layers: the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Mater means mother. So what does dura mean? Have you ever heard of a word that starts with dura? Like durable? This literally means the tough mother. It is the outermost, it is the most superficial meninge, and it is the tough mother made of dense, tough connective tissue. And right below it, you'll have some dural sinuses, and out above it, the epidural space. The next layer of meninges is the arachnoid mater, or instead of spider man, it's spider mom or something. And this is where you'll find the cerebral spinal fluid in the subarachnoid space, so below the arachnoid mater. And then the pia mater is a, what does pia mean? I think it's like delicate mother, and so it's where you're going to find the blood vessels and nerves, and it lays right on the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. So once you pass through the pia mater, you're into nervous tissue, and this is what nourishes the central nervous system. So here is kind of all these grooves, and we call them sulci or fissures depending on where they are, but and you've got some gray matter and some white matter, and you can see the scalp and the cranial bone. And but we want to focus on the meninges. And so your dura mater is this tough fibrous tissue. So it's this, like, I think it's white or a very light blue outer layer. Oh gosh, let me go back. I accidentally clicked. Outer layer of tissue right there that goes all the way around. Now notice sometimes if it's going in one of the sulci or going into a sulcus, it is right here in the middle, but it's still the outer layer because this is within. So this is outside of the brain. And then the next layer is the arachnoid mater, which is the pink. And then you have the pia mater, which is this orange. And then this blue stuff that looks like it's got strings in it, that is our subarachnoid space. So remember, arachnoid, subarachnoid right below it. And so this is filled with fluid, and it helps protect the brain from jarring and also nourishes it. Here's the meninges of the spinal cord. So we have gray matter in the middle now. That's a little bit different. Remember, we had gray matter on the outside of the brain and white matter on the inside. In the spinal cord, we have white matter on the outside and gray on the inside. That could be a test question, huh? And so you have these layers. The pia mater on the inside. Here's your cerebrospinal fluid and the blue. And then your arachnoid mater, purple, and then your dura mater. And then so here's that epidural space that's outside of the dura mater. So the cerebrospinal fluid is produced in four what's called ventricles. These are cavities. They're kind of like caves that have tunnels that connect them within the cerebrospinal fluid, cerebral hemispheres, and the brain stem. And there are four of them. There's two lateral ventricles and a third and a fourth. And then the interventricular foramina and the cerebral aqueduct connect them together. So let's look at where these are. These lateral ventricles are 1 and 2. The third is where they kind of connect here, and you go through your cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. Here is where that interventricular foramen is. And let's talk about cerebrospinal fluid. It is created by the choroid plexus. Make sure you star that. These are capillaries of the pia mater, and they are covered in those ependymal cells we saw in the last chapter. Cerebrospinal fluid is very selective on what substances from the blood can enter the brain. We've talked about the blood-brain barrier a little bit. Cerebrospinal fluid is fills up that space and is nutritive, and also, like I said, protects the central nervous system from jarring. It helps maintain homeostasis of ions and pH. And it's constantly circulating in these ventricles, in the central canal of the spinal cord, and then that subarachnoid space. So once like diffusion and filtration occurs, the cerebrospinal fluid is then absorbed by arachnoid granulations. So you have about 140 milliliters of this cerebrospinal fluid at any time. It's constantly being made by that choroid plexus, and it's constantly being absorbed by the arachnoid granulations. So that's how you maintain about the same volume. And so here are those arachnoid granulations where you can see the cerebrospinal fluid is leaving, and the choroid plexus is kind of right here, and it's producing the cerebrospinal fluid, and it's flowing through all these ventricles and in the subarachnoid space. And then here you can see it flowing in the spinal canal. So traumatic brain injuries, or TBIs, are due to a fall or some accident, oftentimes of sports, and you've probably heard of concussion. And this is a mild brain injury, and it usually doesn't have any lasting symptoms. But if you have repetitive concussions, you can have CTE. And this is where small injuries kind of build up and accumulate over time and can have long-lasting effects, change behavior. I had a student that this happened mid-year. He had just one too many concussions and totally changed his behavior. Was this very serious student, became kind of a class clown. I don't know. Was still really smart, did very well. Is a doctor today, but just changed a little bit about him. And then blast-related brain injury is a severe brain injury, and this is from explosions like with war and years of injury. I mean, it can happen. You can decline years after injury. Sorry. So I already mentioned that the cerebrospinal fluid is continuously being secreted and reabsorbed, and so your fluid remains pretty constant, so the pressure remains pretty constant. And if you interfere with that, oh my goodness, you can change the pressure in these ventricles, and this could cause severe injury of your brain, or could kill you, right? So usually a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture is used to measure the cerebrospinal fluid, and they can relieve some of that pressure by draining that subarachnoid space. My elder brother, who I never met, had hydroencephalitis, and back then they did not treat that if you didn't have insurance. So he eventually, they didn't treat it very quickly, and he ended up being severely brain damaged and only lived for like a few years. All right, so we've learned about the meninges and the ventricles and cerebrospinal fluid. Let's talk about the brain. So the brain does a whole lot of things. We probably already know that, but let's talk about a little bit about the brain development. the neural tube of an embryo gives rise to these parts of the brain. And that's really all I want you to know. So we're not focusing on developmental anatomy. So you can put a big X on this. The only thing I would care is that you know the neural tube is going to be the central nervous system. And so you kind of see here and how it develops over time. And again, don't need to know this. But you do need to know the adult brain. Remember the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So here is a sagittal section of the brain and a little bit of the spinal cord, and you can see a whole lot here. So here's one of those hemispheres, kind of, you can see half of it. This is the cerebrum, and this big thick piece here, we'll talk about it a little bit later, is called the corpus callosum, and it holds the two hemispheres together. The diencephalon is right here in the middle of the brain, and if you think about this, if you injure the middle of your brain, you're gonna die. Like, that's how I remember. That's the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is composed of the thalamus, the pineal gland, and the hypothalamus. So these are major endocrine glands that you need to work. And then here's the cerebellum cut in half, and then you can see the brainstem. The brainstem's made of 3 parts. The pons is right here, the midbrain's up at the top, and then the longer section is the medulla oblongata. Once you go out of that foramen magnum, your spinal cord. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It has the 2 hemispheres, the 2 halves, and the corpus callosum connects them. We saw that right here, this big thing connecting the 2 halves together. Gyri are ridges or convolutions. They are poking out, and sulci sink in. So these are the shallow grooves, like the central sulcus is an example. So you think of a way to remember gyri poke out, guys poke out, and sulci sink in. I don't know, you do you. And then fissures are really deep grooves. We have a longitudinal one that separates the cerebral hemispheres, but also a transverse one that separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. So let's see. Here is the cerebrum. It is this wrinkly part, and so you've got like a sulcus here and a gyri here, how it's kind of poking out. Here's our cerebellum, and this is that transverse fissure, a deep fissure dividing the 2. Here is a lateral sulcus and the central sulcus going along the side. Here's that longitudinal fissure going right down, dividing the left and the right hemispheres. There are some lobes of the cerebrum you do need to know. Frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Should be really easy if you learned the bones that are named after going over these structures. So once again, frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And sometimes they talk about the insula, but we are not. All right. So, like I said, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and then the insula is found deep within the lateral sulcus, but we're going to only talk about the top 4. So the cerebral cortex is a thin layer of the gray matter. Remember, it's on the outside. That's different than the spinal cord, where gray matter is found on the inside. And 75% of your cerebral cortex are these neuron cell bodies. The white matter is right under the cerebral cortex, and it makes most of the cerebrum, and it has those myelinated axons, which is what's making them white. Remember, the oligodendrocytes are doing that. So the cerebral cortex is responsible for your higher mental functions, like interpreting and initiating voluntary movement, reasoning, problem solving, remembering, personality, and there's some specific areas of the cerebral cortex that focus on sensory or association and motor areas, and some that work together. So this is usually a test question. So you need to know that this is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. You need to know that's the cerebrum. You need to know this brainstem. This is the pons, the broken, it's kind of poking out, and then the medulla oblongata. You can't see the midbrain. Okay. We're going to talk about Broca's area in a minute, but it's found here. The auditory area makes sense that it's here near where your eye would be. Remember, this is ventral, and this is the dorsal. And Wernicke's area is here. And then here is that central sulcus. Remember, dividing the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And you see how they're colored pink and yellow? They're talking about these specific gyri. This one is usually dealing with motor control, and this one in the parietal, the first gyri, is dealing with sensory areas involved with your skin. So kind of neat. There is a visual area back here. That's why if you get hit in the brain or hit in the back of the head very hard, you could go blind. So some important areas around the cerebral cortex that are functioning, have a specific function. So here are some of those areas. The cutaneous sensory is on that parietal lobe, and it just lets you know when something's touching your skin. Wernicke's area is a sensory speech area. So that's on the temporal parietal lobe, usually on the left side, and it is for understanding and formulating language. Understanding language, Wernicke. The visual area we saw in the occipital lobe, and it interprets vision, auditory, temporal lobe, hearing. There's a sensory for taste near the base of the central sulcus with the insula, and then smell is deep in the temporal lobes. And so they're just showing you here the motor area and the central sulcus and the sensory in yellow. And then this is like how much of this is related to different body parts. And so like a lot of our motor is with our face and our hands, and then this is, I believe, sensory areas of the cortex. So what you can feel a lot on the hand, a lot on the lips. So surprisingly not too much focus there. Association areas are regions that are not primarily motor or sensory, so they connect to each other and other structures, and they provide memory or reasoning, judgment, emotions. And we really don't focus on these very much. Okay, good. Yeah, so X that last slide, and let's focus on this one. So the primary motor area, remember that's that first fold, that gyri of the frontal lobe before you get to parietal lobe, and it controls voluntary muscle. And Broca's area, I told you we'd get to that, it is controlling the muscles needed for speech. So if you damage Broca's area, but you still have Wernicke's area, you can understand and think of what to say, but if your Broca area is messed up, you can't control the muscle used to make the sound. That would be very frustrating. You might not speak at all, or form words people don't understand. And then the opposite would be you could form speech, but you wouldn't know how to make it. So those are two really important areas for communication. And then frontal eye field is right above Broca's area, and it controls your eyes and your eyelids. So here is the, again, motor and sensory. So motor and sensory area right on either side of that central sulcus. Here are each lobe and what they function. And let's just look at them right here one more time. There's that frontal eye field, Broca's area. Remember, that's for using the muscles to make the words. This is for understanding language and words. Here's the auditory region, visual region, and that's all you can see on there. Be prepared to label some of that on the test. Okay, hemisphere dominance. The left hemisphere is dominant in most people. So what's in that dominant hemisphere? What's on the left hemisphere? Or what's in the dominant hemisphere, I should say, left side for most people, is language, speech, writing, communication, whether it be verbal, analytical, or computational skills. On the non-dominant hemisphere is going to be all your non-verbal things. So music, visual patterns, kinesthetics, emotion, things like that. There are two types of memory. Now, memory is, I love it how they say, the consequence of learning. It involves persistence of learning. So that means just listening to this one time, you probably can't take the test and ace it. You should, I'd hate it if you listened to it more than once, but it helps some people. But looking over your notes, highlighting, being active, persistence of the learning will create memory. Now, there is short-term or working memory where the neurons are connected in a circuit and it's stimulated over and over, and unless it enters long-term memory, you sleep on it and get rid of it. Long-term memory will last a lifetime, and this actually changes the structure of the neurons, makes new synaptic connections, and something called long-term potentiation is an increase in their neurotransmitters that stimulate these memories in these synaptic clefts. Basal nuclei are sometimes called basal ganglia, but in definition, a ganglion is a cluster of neuron bodies in the periphery. So we're talking about the central nervous system, so that doesn't make sense. But we'll stick with basal nuclei. And these are masses of gray matter deep within the cerebral hemisphere. And you don't need to know what they consist of, but they do produce dopamine and help control voluntary movement. And so here you can see a few of those basal nuclei. Parkinson's disease is where your neurons degenerate and it produces the neurotransmitter dopamine. So therefore you have less dopamine that reaches your basal nuclei. And this deficiency will lead to motor problems, tremors, issues with handwriting and speech. There right now is no real treatment that can cure. We just slow down the progression. There's a few treatments that they're trying to use. What causes Parkinson's disease? It could be due to drug use or a pesticide exposure or blows to the head. There is somewhat of a genetic component. Y'all, there's a genetic and environmental component to like everything. So super complicated. Diencephalon is found, remember, in the middle of the brain. If it got injured, you would die. It does surround that third ventricle. It is completely made of gray matter. It's in the middle of the brain. Remember, the white matter on the brain is outside, or most superficial, and the gray is deep. There are some portions of the diencephalon, and you don't need to know most of these, but the thymus, hypothalamus, and pituitary, or pineal, all those are glandular endocrine structures important for regulating homeostasis. And so I don't really want to go into much about the diencephalon, to be quite honest, because we study so much about the thalamus and hypothalamus in anatomy too. But the brain stem is what connects the brain to the spinal cord, and it consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Remember, the gray matter is now on the inside, and the white matter is on the outside, a little bit different than the brain. And so here it is. It's got a lot of structures I will not have you label. All right, so 3 parts: midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The midbrain is what's lying between the diencephalon and the pons, so it's way up under there. It's in the middle of the brain, and it has these fibers that join the lower parts of the brain and to the spinal cord and to the higher part, like where the brain meets the brainstem, pretty much. There is the cerebral aqueduct. Remember that we pointed that out, where the third and fourth ventricle connect. And there's something called cerebral peduncles, or that's how I say them, that are the main motor pathways that connect the cerebrum to the lower portions of our nervous system. And then I don't test you on those. The pons is this bulging part out that comes right out on the underside of the brainstem. And of course, it's found between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. And its job is to regulate rhythm of breathing. The medulla oblongata is this longer oblong and portion of the brainstem, and it's where the brainstem's actually going to connect to the spinal cord. And so it does conduct impulses from the brain to the spinal cord. It has to go through the medulla oblongata, and it's really important. If you injure this, it's fatal, right? Because there are cardiac, your controlling, like opening and closing of blood vessels, and respiratory control centers are all found in the medulla oblongata. It also contains other vital reflexes like coughing, sneezing, swallowing, and vomiting. Reticular formation is also called the reticular activating system, and it is a complex network of these fibers scattered throughout the brainstem and extending into the diencephalon. And its job is to connect to the centers of the hypothalamus, all those basal nuclei we saw, remember the cerebellum in the back, and the cerebrum, with tracts of nerves. If you have a decreased activity of reticular formation, you sleep. And this does cause you to be awake. And so here is, a lot of stuff. So this is that choroid plexus that makes our cerebral spinal fluid. And so this is the corpus callosum. And here you have the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and then the spinal cord starts to form. Here's some more choroid plexus. Let's see. Cerebral aqueduct. Remember, it connects the third to the fourth ventricle. Sleep is so important. Oh my gosh, if you don't sleep, you will die. It says a reversible state of unconsciousness. So you can wake up. You're supposed to wake up. And you have two types. You have REM and non-REM. And REM stands for rapid eye movement. So your book talks about non-rapid eye movement, sleep first. And they say this is when you're very tired, usually restless and dreamless, and you alternate with non-rapid eye movement with REM, rapid eye movement. Rapid eye movement, it's where some of the brain is kind of active, and so this is where your dreams are coming from. And your heart and respiratory rates might be irregular because you're dreaming. There are a number of sleep disorders. Fatal familial insomnia, super rare, really interesting. It's the inability to sleep, so it's fatal, right? You're going to be emotionally unstable. I know I feel that way after traveling. Sometimes we have to pull a few all-nighters, and you might see hallucinations, go into coma. 13 months of onset. Insomnia, the inability to fall asleep or remain asleep. Your teacher suffers from that. Narcolepsy is quite the opposite, is where you have abnormal rapid eye movement sleep, and you get sleepy in the daytime. Let's see. Restless leg syndrome, that's kind of common. Brief repetitive leg jerks during your sleep. You can have leg pain and can wake you up at night. Sleep paralysis, the inability to move for a few minutes after awakening or when falling asleep. I've heard of one person tell me that they had that. All right, let's go from we've done the cerebrum, we've done the midbrain a little bit, just short, knowing that it's going to be very, instrumental in hormone activity. We've done brainstem, and we're now at cerebellum. The cerebellum is that most inferior part, right below the occipital lobes, and it is also two hemispheres like the cerebrum, and it's separated by a falx cerebelli. Let's see. It has the cerebellar cortex, which is gray matter, and arbor vitae, which is the white matter. It's part of the brain. So gray matter on the outside, white matter on the inside. And what do we need to know? Okay, this is the part of the cerebellum that you need to know. It coordinates your skeletal muscle activity and knows where your body parts are. So you know where your hand is without looking at it or feeling for it. It says helps maintain posture, like a remember that's I just lost the word. Oh well. Recent studies suggest other possible roles that the cerebellum have, such as working with the limbic system or the auditory areas. And so here is that cerebellum right below our cerebrum. And here are the major parts of the brain. Love these tables. All right, let's look at an EEG, an electroencephalogram. Anytime you see gram, that's a measurement. Electricity, encephalo. So there are 4 types of brain waves in an EEG. There's an alpha, beta, theta, and delta. And the alpha is when you're awake, but you're resting, your eyes are closed. Beta is active and you're thinking. Theta is mostly in children, and delta is during sleep. And so here they are, alpha, beta, theta, and delta. Not a lot of test questions on that. We are finished with the brain. We are going to move to the spinal cord and be done with this section of our unit. It is a column of nervous tissue that goes from the brain and brainstem and extends all the way through those vertebral canals. The bones are protecting it. Remember, it begins at the foramen magnum and goes all the way to our second lumbar vertebrae. There are 31 segments, each giving rise to a pair of spinal nerves. So lots of nerves coming off of here, and they are numbered in sequence from superior to inferior. So there are portions of the spinal cord you'll need to know. Highlight cervical enlargement and lumbar enlargement. Those are where you're going to see almost like swelling of the spinal cord, and that's where the nerves, the upper limbs and lower limbs, are coming off of the spinal cord. And then structures of the spinal cord. We need to know where the white matter is, the gray matter is. And let's just look at it real quick. So here's that cervical enlargement, how it's kind of swollen. So a lot of neurons, peripheral neurons, are coming off and going to the upper extremities. And then here's our lumbar enlargement. And here you can see it. And this is a cross section of the spinal cord. And you see now our white matter, our myelinated neurons, are on the outside, and unmyelinated neurons are on the inside. And this is what it actually looks like. There are 2 main functions. It is the center for spinal reflexes. So think about, you touch something that's painful, you quickly respond. Even before you feel the pain, you're moving back. And it is a conduit for impulses to and from the brain. So you have to get through the brainstem to get to the brain, right? So let's talk about what a reflex is. It is an automatic response to something, whether it be within or outside the body. I think about the knee-jerk reflex, which you'll do a lab on. And these help maintain homeostasis and reacting to the environment. And a reflex arc is the neurons that are used to do a reflex, and they have to be 2 or more neurons. You have to have information coming in and information coming out. And so, but a simple reflex arc is going to contain only the sensory and motor neurons, but most of them contain the sensory, inter, and motor neuron. So this is a reflex arc. So this would be the spinal cord, and this would be a sensory neuron, and maybe the inner neurons here, and then a motor neuron's coming off, or it's sensory and motor if we're talking about a simple reflex arc. And so here you can see what I'm talking about. The skin is receiving information. Maybe it's hot, and that information goes hot, 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 and it talks to the interneuron, which tells the muscles of the arm to contract and respond to that quickly. And so here are the parts of a reflex arc. Star this, highlight this, need to know what the parts are and what they do. So there is a monosynaptic or stretch reflex where you have these, it's a simple reflex to neurons. It only has that one synapse that happens, and an example of this is the patellar or knee jerk reflex. You'll see it in a lab. And this also helps maintain an upright posture, believe it or not. The withdrawal reflex is what I was talking about when you touch something painful, and this is going to prevent damage and infection. And there's polysynaptic, where you have the sensory, inter, and motor, and reciprocal innervation, where there's flexors and extensors, both being spoken to. So this is super freaking cool. You've got the patellar ligament here, and you hit it with a hammer. And so receptors associated with that send information to the spinal cord here, and then quickly to a motor neuron back to this muscle, and causes the leg to, right? We're going to contract this muscle, and it's going to pull on these bones, and psh, up comes the leg. Now, these are my favorite, the withdrawal reflex. So you've stepped on a tack. You break your mother's back. I don't know, was that a crack or a tack? I don't know. So here's this pain, going up to an interneuron and signaling to move. So we're using more than one neuron, the orange, the pink, and the blue. Crossed extensor reflex. This is super neat. So this is during withdrawal, your flexors are affected. So ipsilateral, if you remember that, and extensors are inhibited. At the same time, the extensors on the opposite side are contracted and the flexors are inhibited. And so this shifts your body weight so that you stay upright. This is so neat. So when you step on a tack, not only does your brain tell muscles to contract to lift this foot, but if you didn't make this leg strong, you'd fall down. So it also tells muscles of the opposite leg to contract to keep you upright. And so there's a few types: the knee jerk reflex, the plantar reflex, bicep and tricep jerk reflex, quite a few. And they are used by doctors to assess nervous condition and if there's damage. So ascending tracts are sensory impulses going to the brain, and descending tracts are motor impulses from the brain going usually to muscles or glands. And so not a lot on these tracks we're not going to learn, and don't need that, and don't need that, and don't need that. ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, or motor neuron disease, is when the motor neurons in the spinal cord, brainstem, and the cerebral cortex, the motor neurons start to degenerate, to break down. And this could be due to too much microglia. Remember the glial cells that are tiny that kind of do phagocytosis? They can kill the neurons if they're overactive. There could be too many oxygen-free radicals, or the astrocytes cannot control what goes to the motor neuron. So what does it look like for someone who has Lou Gehrig's disease? They have difficulty speaking. Sometimes they drag their foot. They're fatigued. They have weak cognitive function is usually normal, and but their motor use starts to go away. And really, really sad. Brain is perfectly fine. Don't talk to them like they're slow. They're very smart. They know exactly what you're saying. They just might not be able to respond normally. And eventually the respiratory muscles are affected, and there's problems there, and it's fatal. There is no cure, unfortunately. And remember, 10% is inherited, and the rest, is environmental. Spinal cord injuries are very serious, and depending on where it's located and how much damage there is determines the severity. Injuring an ascending tract you don't feel pain. So think about an ascending tract as going to the brain. You don't feel, you can't smell. A descending tract would mean you're paralyzed. And so they are trying to regenerate those things. All right, so we talked about central nervous system, and the next video will be on the peripheral nervous system. It'll be a little bit shorter for you, and then we'll be ready to do our labs and a practice and a test.